Well, I read the story on Friday, and we've got a new health secretary in post on Saturday, and I think that's about the right pace to proceed in a pandemic.
He allegedly called his former health secretary hopeless, then refused to sack him when he broke the rules, then tried to give the impression he did. Tonight, what does this say about the Prime Minister's own judgment and ability to make tough calls?
SAJID, JAVID.
Tonight, as we try to assess the fallout from the Hancock resignation and where it leaves the PM, we hear from SAJID JAVID's former advisor, Sonia Khan, who was sacked from her own job by Dominic Cummings. Also tonight, a special report into failings at Greater Manchester Police as their own officers tell us they're letting down victims of crime.
I'm a police officer, and I wouldn't feel confident reporting a crime to my own force.
Hello, good evening. The new Health Secretary wasted little time on his first day in the job, confirming his desire to see the country reopen on July the 19th and warning the public they'd have to get used to living with rather than seeing off the COVID virus. SAJID JAVID established that social care, NHS reform, sorting the backlog would all be his early priorities. But he also made clear his concerns about the now disabled camera that caught his predecessor Matt Hancock so unpityingly on video. Questions about that resignation came to the fore today over the Prime Minister's handling of the case. Why, Labour asked, had he been too slow and too weak to sack a minister who could himself see it was time to go? Speaking to reporters, the PM appeared to suggest he had. We'll ask what rules were broken, what issues remain and why they matter in a moment. But first, to Nick Watt, who's got some emerging news. Nick, tell us what you've learned.
Well, Emily, clearly a new broom at the top of the Department of Health and a big hint from SAJID JAVID that he hopes to make a big move on schools so that from September, school children would no longer have to automatically self-isolate if they come into contact with a positive case. Now, 3 times he was asked about this in the House of Commons this afternoon. He was asked, for example, look at the way that on the 17th of June, I think it was 250,000 pupils were away from school. And in each answer, he gave a stronger response. So he said this is a very important issue. There is research being done on it. He hopes to give a response as soon as possible, but still work to be done on this.
Interesting. Nick, tell us what else we saw from SAJID JAVID today, first in the job.
Well, quite a change in language from Matt Hancock. So he had praise for the Tory conservative lockdown sceptics. He was talking, as you say, about meeting that 19th of July target for opening up. And he was saying there is no turning back when you make that decision. But then he said that's why you need to be really careful in coming to that decision. Look, SAJID JAVID is in this post because Matt Hancock resigned. So today I've been looking at how the events of the last 72 hours, what they tell us about Boris Johnson.
Go on then. Right.
Pictured in his element,
Oh no!
leading from the front, a decisive move in one direction, then packing a punch the other way. Maybe not quite so agile on his feet these days, but still able to move on the political stage at breakneck speed. In happier times together, and on Friday, foursquare behind Matt Hancock after news that he'd broken COVID rules he had set for the nation. The matter is closed, intoned number 10. But today, with Matt Hancock very much an ex-health secretary, praise from the Prime Minister for his decision to resign. And what's this? A suggestion perhaps that the Prime Minister had had a hand in the about turn.
That's right, and that's why when I saw the story on Friday, we had a new Secretary of State for Health in on Saturday.
Matt Hancock's position within the Cabinet began to crumble on Friday as Conservative MPs voiced the fear that one rule appeared to apply to Cabinet ministers and another to everyone else. But it took some time for the penny to drop. I'm told that at as late as midday on Saturday, Matt Hancock was telling colleagues, "I am resolute," as he made clear that he would not be quitting. The message appears not to be getting through to Matt Hancock, one colleague complained. By early afternoon, he'd sniffed the wind and decided to go and informed the Prime Minister. All along, Boris Johnson had been telling colleagues, we do need to give Matt Hancock some space.
And congratulations to you all on achieving or indeed retaining the great offices of state that you hold.
Boris Johnson's instinct is to stand by loyal members of his tribe against what he regards as the baying media mob. But you don't survive as long as Boris Johnson has without acutely tuned antennae. And that can mean turning on a sixpence, sometimes at the speed of light. One former colleague is unsurprised by the Prime Minister's dexterity.
This is part of the art of being Boris Johnson, is as well as being an apparently very vivid and decisive and flamboyant figure, he's able to sort of cut his political trail so that it suits him. The phrase David Cameron is meant to have used about him, he's a kind of greased albino piglet who can wriggle his way out of whatever trouble he's in. And there's certainly that element to Boris Johnson, and Cameron was right about that.
And that gets him out of a problem, but does it eventually store up problems? People think, what on earth?
It's a very interesting question, and people for years have said, this is it. Boris Johnson's gone too far. He's finished. He's insulted the people of Liverpool or the people of Portsmouth, or he's told porkies about his private life or whatever, all of which are charges you can lay at him. And people have said quite confidently, he's finished. But each time he seems to come back.
And that's
Labour believes the last few days show the Prime Minister is not invincible.
Boris Johnson not sacking Matt Hancock shows great weakness in leadership. We've had here a Secretary of State that has been found to be utterly useless. And now we have a Prime Minister who is also useless. He's not been able to show the leadership that we needed. He didn't gauge the public compass and the mood and the anger that people felt, and genuinely felt let down. But this isn't the first time they've been felt let down by Matt Hancock and the Secretary of State. They were let down when care homes were exposed to the virus. They were let down when PPE wasn't there for healthcare staff. But on this occasion, Boris Johnson should have been decisive and should have sacked him, but it shows a lack of leadership that has been wanting throughout this last year.
Gearing up to celebrate Pride Month, a smile on everyone's face, though political clouds are rarely far from view in Downing Street.
That was Nick Watt. And joining us now, Sonia Khan, who worked as a special advisor to SAJID JAVID and was escorted out of her job by a police officer after being sacked by Dominic Cummings. She later won a case of unfair dismissal. Andrew Bridgen is a backbench Conservative MP, and Alistair Campbell was Downing Street Director of Strategy under Tony Blair. And a warm welcome to you all. Sonia, if I can start with you. All this talk about how Boris Johnson doesn't like sacking people, is that a Prime Minister you recognise? Do you see loyalty or wriggling piglet?
It's a good question, and I think the truth is I don't know. It's a question you'll have to ask him. My process wasn't a joyous one, so I can't imagine he enjoyed that. But I think what doesn't look good, though, is allowing a minister to resign and then saying they're sacked, because it just reduces public trust even further. And it suggests that his decision-making is entirely based on public perception of the situation. The public wanted him to be sacked instead of resigned, and so he decided to spin the narrative. And I think that's what people hate the most, the sense that politicians are trying to pull the wool over their eyes. And it's not really something that's fine for now, because how do we know when to trust the Prime Minister? When is his sort of decision-making going to turn next? How do we know which sort of deadlines are final, which rules we need to follow?
You were dispatched pretty brutally by his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. Is that how he prefers things to be done? I mean, do you see it as, there are sort of henchmen who take care of those things for him?
I mean, I don't think so, because it's not something that's happened since. And I get a sense that lessons have been learned, not least in terms of how you use the Metropolitan Police and whatever else. And it does seem like actually there is a slightly maybe kinder approach in allowing people to resign. You see it with lots of aides as much as you do with ministers.
In terms of people inside the Cabinet looking on at this and everything that's gone before, is your sense that people can behave pretty much as they wish within Cabinet or at the higher echelons of government because they know that very little punishment or rebuke will come their way?
I mean, I spent 5 years in government and I had always known it to be the opposite. There was such a focus on public perception. And actually, it was harder to get people to show the human side of them, whether in interviews or going out to, meet the public. There was a sense of, never getting things wrong. And that's why you get, politicians who can't remember what football team they support, what biscuit they like when they do things. So actually, I've seen so many politicians, especially at cabinet level, be so controlled about their public image. So it's a real surprise for a situation like this to happen now, especially when it feels like we've spent years getting away from the sleaze that defined kind of the Johnson the Major era.
Andrew Bridgen, can I pick up with you? Do you think that the Matt Hancock resignation has set a new precedent, or do you think after this it will return to sort of how things were? We saw whether it was Priti Patel or Robert Jenrick or actually previously Matt Hancock on failing to declare a state in a family company that won an NHS contract, again, a technical breach of the ministerial code. Will it just revert to what we have got used to?
We all saw the graphics of it all. But I think, Emily, you've been around politics and I've been in politics long enough to know what really happens. So when the Matt Hancock story broke on Thursday night late, on Friday, the Prime Minister had two choices: sack him immediately or endorse him. There was no third way. And loyalty is normally seen as a virtue. But the Chief Whip would have been negligent in his job if in return for that endorsement on the Friday, he hadn't got Matt Hancock's undated resignation letter. If you look the way it unfolded, the moment Matt Hancock had to apologise for breaking his own rules, the game was up. He'd lost public confidence, and that was essential for the Health Secretary, any cabinet minister, and especially during a pandemic. And on the Saturday, Matt Hancock's letter of resignation appears. Only minutes later, the Prime Minister's well-typed out response, and 90 minutes after that, you've got SAJID JAVID replacing him as Secretary of State for Health. I don't think those things happened in real time, Emily. I think it's naive to think they did.
But why did the Prime Minister make that sort of awkward statement today, which made it sound like he thought he had sacked Matt Hancock? I mean, do you think he does think that?
Well, if you look at the events as I've rolled them out to you, effectively, the game was up as soon as Matt Hancock lost public confidence. That's essential for any cabinet minister, and particularly for a health secretary during a pandemic.
Well, Andrew, just explain this then.
He just couldn't stand up in front of the
public
public
anymore. Why wouldn't the Prime Minister then show leadership? Why wouldn't you take that as an opportunity to say, I know everyone thinks that I don't like confrontation or I have a problem dealing with things. Why wouldn't you have shown leadership as the Prime Minister then?
He did show leadership because for that endorsement on the Friday, he'd already got Matt Hancock's undated resignation letter.
Alistair Campbell, it does seem that this should be a God's gift, really, to the opposition party. You've got old-fashioned sleaze, you've got a PM who appears to be dithering, you've got broken rules and by all accounts, a pretty furious public. And yet this has been entirely created by the Conservatives themselves.
Well, I think, this discussion needs to sort of elevate itself a bit, Emily. I mean, honestly, we're talking here as though this is just sort of, he said this and did he sack him, didn't he sack him? There are really, really important principles at stake here. There are principles that are meant to govern public life, the Nolan principles. And I think Johnson fails on all of them. Honesty, openness, objectivity, selflessness, integrity, accountability, and leadership. Now, maybe he leads by example in that in breaking all those rules as regularly as he does, he gives permission to people like Priti Patel to break the ministerial code and get away with it, Michael Gove to break the law and say it doesn't matter, Hancock to do the same, Jenrick, as you say, to do the same. He's got a cabinet entirely dependent upon him for the patronage, and the entire cabinet entirely dependent on the fact that they had to commit themselves to Johnson's Brexit deal. And I think that what we're seeing in our public life now is what happens when somebody like Johnson, who I think both in his political and personal life is very much lacking any kind of moral compass, when they become Prime Minister on the back of a Brexit referendum where he led the lies that won it, and now you're in this bizarre position where in this government you will not get sacked for lying, you will not get sacked for cheating, you'll not get sacked for being useless at your job like most of them are, but you will get sacked if you tell the truth about what's happening in the country.
Okay.
We are a very, very crazy state. Andrew, and by the way, Francis, out of the world of the Euros.
Thank you for that breaking news. I'll tell Nick Watt, he'll be back. Andrew Bridgen, will you respond to that? You're shaking your head.
Well, I think Alice has got a very selective memory of the last Labour government. I thought we were going to talk about the health department. We've got a crisis in health due to the pandemic. 4.7 million people.
Yeah, he's talking about something bigger, isn't he? He's talking about impunity and propriety in public office.
If you let me finish. 4.7 million people waiting for appointments in the NHS. The last time this happened was in 2007. We had the excuse of the pandemic. That's what's caused this problem in our health service. What was Labour's excuse in 2007 when the economy was booming just before their Great Recession in 2008? Can Alistair answer that question?
You're losing the plot here. You're losing the plot. If you want to have an argument about how well your government has handled the pandemic, then we can have that. Do you agree with me that your government does not uphold standards that I listed there? Are they open? For example, about the COVID contracting? Are they transparent, for example, about some of these relationships that we're seeing that are now coming to the open?
The pressure on the government.
Is the Prime Minister somebody that you trust to tell the truth, because the public don't?
Well, the local elections tell a different story, Alistair, and we'll see in the Batley and Spen by-election on Thursday what the public think.
We're not going to talk about Batley and Spen. Andrew, let me ask you something more general. We're not going to talk about Batley and Spen tonight, but what I do want to say is, if the public are voting for you, does that mean that no bad behaviour or no breaking of ministerial codes or no impropriety in public office matters? Is that basically where you stand?
No, but it's all right me going up against Alistair. Alistair's got his viewpoint, I've got mine. Ultimately, we live in a democracy where we answer to the British public. I'm not sure that Alistair's government, the government he supported, always did.
Let me bring you in, Sonia, on that point, because you did say that the Prime Minister seems to sort of want to please the public. I mean, fundamentally, I guess that has worked for him in the sense that he's in power and he's got a solid majority.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we come out of lockdown, he's only going to play on this more. You know, he's someone who thrives when he's out and about, sort of meeting people. So it plays into that, whereas we haven't really seen how Keir Starmer sort of does in those environments. He works far more effectively in something that's really, really controlled. But I did want to pick up on something that Alistair said that I think is a live risk for the government, which is, as these scandals keep happening, there won't be the cloak of COVID to provide forgiveness. I do think that there's a level of goodwill towards the government because COVID was a challenge like no other. I don't think any one country was perfect at managing it. But as soon as we're sort of back to business as usual, where is that goodwill going to exist? I mean, I assume there'll be a lot more sort of newspaper coverage. People will be engaged with it more. There'll be more space for proper discussion and scrutiny. So it is a very live challenge.
Alistair, why is Keir Starmer so polite in this whole debate? Why isn't he as impassioned as your rant has just been? Maybe I can ask you, because it's been reported that Labour MPs are trying to get your Tony Blair back in the Commons. Can you categorically rule out that is hyperbole and that people are happy with Keir Starmer?
Well, I don't think the idea of Tony Blair going back to lead the Labour Party is for the birds. But I mean, look,
well, it isn't. Sorry, you don't think it is, or it isn't?
I think it's for the birds. And honestly, I really wish we could have this discussion, not just about the personalities involved. These are really serious principles. We have, as our Prime Minister, somebody who has an incredibly casual relationship with the truth. The BBC yet to play that Peter Stefanovic video, which had 25 million views, of a series of lies that he's told in the dispatch box. Now, that used to be a resigning offence. And I will argue any day of the week against Andrew Bridgen about the Labour government record and also about our determination to try to live up to high standards. Okay. Johnson doesn't even try.
Okay.
And Labour, yes, I think should be more aggressive, not just on this, but on their failures on COVID and on the fact that Brexit is going so badly wrong for the country. But we have a government without a moral compass.
All right.
And
we're out of time.
Have a Prime Minister without a moral compass.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks to all three. Thank you. Now, what do we want from the police if we're the victim of a crime? A speedy investigation with the perpetrator caught and charged. But residents of Greater Manchester learned at the end of last year that instead of that, their police force hadn't even been recording tens of thousands of crimes reported to it. Greater Manchester Police was placed under special measures to improve. Now a Newsnight investigation has heard from serving officers who say victims are still being let down by the force, and even they, as police officers, wouldn't report a crime to GMP if they or their family were a victim. In a moment, we'll have an interview with the new Chief Constable who took over just last month. But first, our UK editor Katie Razzle and her producer Sally Chesworth have been hearing from people inside his force.
I'm a police officer, and I wouldn't feel confident reporting a crime to my own force.
We've been told to do the bare minimum on crimes. People are literally walking the streets, not being arrested.
We're only so bad that cops are leaving in the droves to join other forces, or they're just giving up.
These are the words of serving officers at Greater Manchester Police. They're speaking out to Newsnight about what they say are serious failings at GMP. Last year, an inspection found the second largest force in England and Wales had failed to record more than 80,000 crimes in a year. 1 in 5 of all crimes reported to the police weren't making it onto the books. GMP is in special measures. The Chief Constable at the time was forced to resign, and the new one's only been in post for a matter of weeks. What we're hearing is that he has a huge job on his hands to restore the public's trust and the confidence of his own officers.
I don't think I'd want to have started my policing career anywhere other than where I started it. That's how good I look back on it. Busy, dangerous, everything that you would expect to be involved in. And fast forward 28 years, there were some fantastic times, but I couldn't wait to leave. Time had taken its toll.
Serving officers rarely speak out for fear of reprisals. Scott Winters left Greater Manchester Police in 2017. His relationship with the force is acrimonious. 2 years earlier, he'd taken it to an employment tribunal. Scott claims the GMP he loved became one that put reputation ahead of tackling problems.
There's a very, very defensive culture. If they come forward as a whistleblower, someone who's concerned about the job, history tells us they will get targeted.
He's watched in dismay what's been emerging, particularly after the inspectors judged that by failing to record all those crimes, instead of protecting victims, GMP was leaving them at risk.
I think it's dire, unforgivable, abysmal. It's cheating the public. They've been let down. They are a victim of crime and they've not had the crime recorded, 2, a chance of the perpetrators being brought to justice and punished.
Serving officers we've heard from say it's still going on. One told us this.
If you've got a drug dealer across the street from you, a really naughty boy who might have a firearm, the chances of him getting arrested are lower than ever. That's not safe. And it's advertising for every other naughty boy in Greater Manchester to get at it because the force is on its arse.
Another said,
I'd say criminals are luckier now because a lot more are wanted in Greater Manchester and they're literally walking the streets not being arrested.
So what does that feel like if you've reported a crime?
When she was 13, 14, something like that, she just became a different girl. Previously she'd been bubbly, happy, outgoing, and suddenly she started to lose her spirit, if you like.
We're calling this mum Patricia. Nearly 2 years ago, she walked into Rochdale Police Station with her daughter, who'd finally found the courage to report allegations that as a teenager, just a few years before, she'd been groomed and repeatedly raped by a man they thought was a family friend. She'd tried to end her life twice.
We went in and the detective we spoke to already had a pile of papers on his desk and a photograph. He asked us, "Is this the man in question?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Yeah, we know a lot of stuff about this man." So I thought, brilliant, they already know who he is, so it'll be dealt with really, really well. My daughter gave a really lucid account, but at one point I had to leave the room because I couldn't hear what had happened, what he'd done. I just couldn't bear it.
Her daughter, who we're calling Olivia, handed over her phone containing messages from the man she'd accused. Then, after several weeks of hearing nothing, Olivia was asked to make another statement at a different police station.
She had to go through the whole thing again. A 4-hour interview with yet another male officer. No liaison officer, no female officer, nothing. And then she came out and rang me crying, saying, "Mum, I've had to do another interview." And I was just shocked. I thought, what's gone wrong? And they don't know where her phone is. They were saying, "No, we haven't got your phone."
A third detective found her phone, but then got moved to another job. A fourth took over, but he hadn't even looked at the evidence the phone had generated, and other evidence the family had handed over had gone missing.
She did contact the detective and said, "Will you keep me informed and let me know what's the outcome?" And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm too busy for that." And I actually heard him say that because she had him on loudspeaker. I was furious. I was just disgusted because she's been made to feel like she's pestering or mithering them. To me, they're absolutely incompetent. There's no other word to sum them up but incompetent.
GMP told us those who report abuse would be taken seriously, treated with empathy and supported. It said some historic investigations were distressing, time-consuming and complex, but it was determined to conclude them to the evidential standards required to bring offenders to justice. The serving officers themselves have told us vulnerable victims are being failed even now. One pointed specifically to sex offence victims still being let down.
For me, that is the most horrible crime, and victims need the best service. We're not only failing them, but the victim code of practice isn't being followed. It sets out how often victims should be contacted with an update while the case is active, but that doesn't get done as it should.
They tell us many of the problems are down to a new computer system that went live 2 years ago.
IOPS, GMP's integrated operational policing system, has been dubbed IFLOPS by insiders. It replaced 3 computer systems that were critical to how the force functions, but it was beset by problems from the start, with its launch delayed by more than a year.
In every borough of Greater Manchester, I can't think of a borough where memories of a homicide investigation don't come flooding back to me.
Until last year, Paul Bailey was a detective with GMP working on major incidents. A vocal critic of the force, he remembers the frustrations IOPS brought with it only too well.
And I understand that they're even back to paper and pen now. So, full circle.
Because the computer system's not working?
Because the computer system doesn't work. I don't think it's ever worked, has it? It felt like it had been designed by someone who'd never worked, never been a police officer and never worked in the streets. When you try to input details of a crime, which is key, if you can't record a crime, then what use are we? Operational police officers need to be working on the most up-to-date and credible intelligence. A simple example is if there was intelligence regarding firearms at an address or premises, and officers were sent to that address and didn't know that, then the outcome could be a poor one for everyone involved.
The radio panic buttons linked to the system were cause for concern too, as Paul discovered one shift when a colleague pressed it by accident. The system should have located their car, but it failed.
The communication suite didn't know who we were and didn't know where we were. Now, that's a real problem, because if this was a real emergency and we were in trouble, then no one would know where we were and we wouldn't receive any backup. We could have been dying in the ditch and no one would have known about it.
With mounting concerns about public protection, the Police Inspectorate did a review of IOPS. Published in March last year, it highlighted a catalogue of serious issues. GMP was said to be prioritising action on the most high-risk ones.
15 months on from that report, you'd expect any major problems to have been ironed out. But the serving officers we've heard from say IOPS is still absolutely not fit for purpose, and in fact, it's putting them and the public in danger.
The panic buttons on our radios that are linked to IOPS still fail. I pressed mine and it came up I was in a different part of Greater Manchester. That is a real risk if someone needs backup and the system can't tell where you are.
Also,
firearms markers are a big concern because many are missing. If the marker isn't there, you don't know the risks. That's happened to me personally. The system should have said that a person had access to a firearm, but it wasn't listed. If you're missing information, you're putting people at risk. Neighbours, the public, as well as officers.
Here's another.
I was looking for some firearms intel on someone. Stuck his name in and it delivered 5 cards, all with his name on. Each one had to be gone through individually, opened, read and closed before he had any idea what we knew about him. It took 5 times as long as it used to, and even then you can't trust what you're reading is the whole picture. You could be dealing with gangster number 1 in Salford. Major organised crime gang players, and there's a black hole where the recent intelligence should be.
Gail Hadfield Granger's been keeping a watch on the force since her partner Anthony Granger was shot dead in a GMP operation in 2012. She's since set up as a legal consultant and operates out of a high street office in Bolton.
What happened to Anthony is horrific and it's so wrong. I don't want that to happen to anybody else, and if I can help people understand what rights they've got, then, you know, we can possibly make a better police force by holding them to account.
A public inquiry found GMP to blame for the death of the unarmed Anthony Granger and revealed many failings, including errors in the compilation of intelligence.
Anthony lost his life. The intelligence system was flawed. GMP were ordered by the judge to ensure that, you know, this doesn't happen again. When I find out that the new intelligence system that they have now, which is the IOPS, is actually putting more people at risk, you then think, so what actually has been done? What systemic changes have been made? And what effort have they actually made to make sure that they don't do the same as they did to Anthony, to other people? It just seems like one failure after another.
Stephen Watson, the new Chief Constable, is already on record about the tough task he faces to turn the force around.
There are improvements that have to be made and will be made rapidly. That is not to say that GMP is a failing force.
What he's got to do is huge. This isn't any easy task. He needs to be pretty much a miracle worker. With the right culture, with the right person in charge, it can be great again.
One thing that we don't want to see is a plaster being put over, which eventually will then come off. I think these are serious systemic changes that need to be changed from the root of the problem. I don't think this is a quick fix.
It's approaching 2 years since Patricia and Olivia first reported allegations of historic child sexual abuse to GMP. While they've had what they say is life-saving support from a foundation ironically run by an ex-GMP detective, Maggie Oliver, from the force itself, they'd had no update for weeks until Newsnight got in touch with GMP.
What this man did has ruined probably the best years of her life. It's given her such bad anxiety that she's on antidepressants, maximum dose. She can't sleep. She's just not the girl she used to be. He's caused all that and he's still out there. He's not even been arrested. Surely they've got to start making some changes quickly, because the amount of times I've said to the police, if I come home and find my daughter dead, God help me for what will happen, because it would be their fault. It'd be their fault because they've not acted promptly. They've just not dealt with things the way that they should.
The Police Inspectorate has told Newsnight it's in close contact with Greater Manchester Police's new Chief Constable. We understand it's already begun gathering evidence as part of its next imminent inspection of the force.
Katie Razzle reporting there, and you can hear more on Gail Hadfield Granger's story in the documentary One Night in March on BBC Sounds. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to Greater Manchester Police's new Chief Constable, Stephen Watson. You saw very briefly the end of that report. I started by asking him his response to Olivia's case.
Well, my thoughts are that what we've heard talks to a level of service that simply isn't good enough. Of course, I would stress that this doesn't necessarily make for a typical case, but one like this is one far too many.
Have you made contact with the family? Will you intervene and will you apologise?
I will apologise, absolutely, on the basis of, if nothing else, the fact that this is a family very worried about a vulnerable person put upon in extraordinary circumstances and, frankly, just not getting the service that they need from GMP. I'm more than happy to apologise, but I suspect what they perhaps will want from us is for us to pursue every line of inquiry professionally, promptly, expeditiously, and that is what I will ensure takes place in this instance.
Can I just clarify whether you knew about this case, whether you had already made contact with the family because you were aware of it?
I am aware of this case. It is not a case that I personally have been previously aware of. But you will understand that it, having been brought to my attention, has caused me to make some inquiries. I am confident that the officer in the case has lines of inquiry to pursue. What I will be ensuring is that we do a review as to how we came to be in this position in the first instance. And I want to understand what it is that this says about us, whether there is anything systemic in this or whether it is an individual failing. So I've yet to get to the bottom of it, but will be doing so personally.
We would hope, obviously, it was one individual failing, but we're hearing through the Maggie Oliver Foundation of several more, many young women who've come to them who they are now supporting, at least 15 that they've told us, who need support because they have been turned away and turned off the process of reporting this kind of crime as a result of what they've been through with your force.
The notion that there is a systemic failing at the very heart of our process isn't borne out by the evidence that I've seen thus far.
There is a systemic failing. That's the reason why you have been brought into this job, because some 220 crimes a day, 80,000 over the course of a year were going unregistered, unrecorded. You've heard from a serving officer in your force who says, I wouldn't feel confident reporting a crime to my own force. We heard that several times from several serving and former officers, an appalling indictment on your own staff and systems.
Yes, it is. What I would say, however, is that the issue that we were just addressing related to child sexual abuse, and it is that I don't know falls into the same category of broad systemic under-recording of crime. But there is a systemic issue of the under-recording of crime, and it is part of the reason why I have been brought in as the new Chief Constable. There's no doubt about it. Our systems, processes, structures are in need of reform, and we have already instigated a programme of reform to be delivered at pace.
Let's look at the systems then, because the IOPS is the one that we've heard a lot about in the film. Panic radio buttons not working properly, so officers on the job in dangerous situations were not being found. Firearms markers were lacking. They didn't know who had guns and who didn't. Tasks that should take 30 minutes, taking 3 hours, a massive waste of police time. Can you say categorically IOPS is going to go? You'll get rid of that system because it's endangering people's lives.
What I can say categorically is that I will be in a position before too long to make an informed decision as to the future. How much more informed
do you want to be? I'm sorry, sir, but when you've got that evidence before you, when you know that your own officers are in danger and they don't feel able to say that they're keeping the public safe, how much more information do you need?
Well, essentially, what I'm not quibbling with, and the information that I do have, tells me that it doesn't work. What I am currently waiting for, and have initiated it on day one, I'm 3 weeks into this job. But what I initiated on day one was an independently validated technical appraisal of the recovery plan, which is to say that which we have, can it be made to work better, ironing out all of these issues which officers tell me about.
Yeah.
If it cannot, what are the options for doing something differently?
I'll be really honest, but I don't think you have very long, given the numbers that we have obtained from a Freedom of Information request that show how many people currently are applying to transfer out of that force. It was 155 officers who applied to go to the neighbouring Lancashire force. Now, that is up from just 5 in 2017, and that's as a result, we understand, of a system that has lost the trust of your force. They want to get out.
And I've addressed that very issue myself. I think there are a number of officers who are voting with their feet. Whether it can all be fairly attributed to IOPS is speculation, but I know that IOPS is certainly not helping. It is part and parcel of the issues that have been very, very clearly put across to me. And as I was explaining, I am embarked on a process for sorting it out. It's all very well, almost encouraging the sort of glib, I'll throw it out and get something else. Well, we're talking of many, many millions of pounds in 2 and 3 years worth of a procurement programme here. So these things do need to be properly considered.
Chief Constable, just before we go, let me ask you something relevant to where we are today. The former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, we now know has been reported to the police for breaking lockdown laws. Does a breach like that make it harder for your force, for any force, to do their jobs?
Well, of course, regulations are there to be enforced, and of course those in positions of leadership do need to demonstrate their own responsible adherence to the regulations that are set. And by definition, what we don't want is people questioning the reason for having to abide by regulations. And so it is, of course, important for all people to abide by the regulations, such as to make the enforcement of the same legitimate.
Stephen Watson, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And just to say, if you have been affected by issues raised in Katie Razzle's film, details of organisation offering information support with child sexual abuse are available at bbc.co.uk/actionline, or you can call for free at any time to hear recorded information on 0800 077 077. Sadly, that is all we have time for this evening, but I'm back tomorrow. Thanks for joining us this evening. Hope you're back then too. Bye-bye.